On to Welcome to Fair Housing Friday, a series we started a couple years ago as part of our Fair Housing Month in April. My name is Kalia Livingston, and I am the Fair Housing Project Education and Outreach Coordinator at the Champlain Valley Office of Economic Opportunity. Joining me today is Jess Hyman, who is the Associate Director of CVO's statewide housing advocacy programs. Along with Jess, we also have our special guest, who is Jessica Bridge, broker, owner of Element Realtor and Heaney Realtors. Jessica will discuss her general responsibilities as a real estate professional and talk about how she executes her duties to carry out fair housing laws. We will also discuss the practices she has adopted to maintain ethical real estate transactions and make sure home buyers and sellers are satisfied. Thank you all for your participation and joining us today. Please keep your microphones muted as interviews are taking place, and we will have time for questions during the last 15 minutes of the webinar. Please note that we are recording this webinar and it will be available on our Fair Housing Month website, which is fairhousingmonthvt.org. We will do our best to make this dialogue accessible to all audience members, but feel free to ask any clarifying questions in the chat. We will also be sharing additional resources in the chat and in our follow-up email. Before we hear from our guests, I would like to share some information about the Fair Housing Project. The Fair Housing Project is one of CVO's statewide housing advocacy programs. We offer fair housing trainings to all interested community members, which include housing providers, service providers, and municipal officials, and really anyone who is interested in learning more about their rights and obligations under the Fair Housing Act. We also support people who are experiencing illegal housing discrimination with one-on-one consultations, and we help them navigate their housing situations and figure out the next best steps for them to take. I would like to say a huge thank you to our sponsors and partners for supporting our housing justice work. Let's pause and take a moment to uplift our sponsors and partners. Thank you to all of these groups and organizations who are supporting our Fair Housing Month activities. It would be really difficult to do without you, and I'm very grateful to have all of these sponsors and partners working with us and collaborating on wonderful events and being able to do things like Fair Housing Friday and our Fair Housing Month kickoffs and the many other things that we've done throughout this month this year. All right, and now to Jessica. Jessica, would you mind introducing yourself and describe your role and general tasks and responsibilities as a broker and realtor?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate being here. And I got to watch some of the previous seminars, and so um, I think this is great. I think this is just makes all of this information a lot more accessible. So well done. So I am the owner, I'm the co-owner and principal broker at Element Real Estate. And we have offices in Burlington and in Stowe, Vermont. And I am also one of the co-owners of Heaney Realtors, with offices in Montpelier and in Barrie. And my role, I kind of operate on two levels. So um, as the broker, principal broker, and owner, I sort of set the standard for how the work is done within our company. And I'm also a practicing realtor. So I have my own buyer and seller clients. And so I guide them through the process of buying and selling real estate. And it is a lengthy and detailed process. So that can mean advising clients on depending on who I'm working with, seller or buyer, but advising them on pricing and strategy, negotiation, risk, um, and ensuring that every one of those considerations, and that my behavior is ethical and compliant We are in a really highly regulated industry, and as well we should be. This is really, these are generally people's largest assets, and buying and selling real estate is not something that people do every day. Sometimes people never do it in their lives. Sometimes people do it once in their lives. And, sometimes people do it 10 or 20 times throughout their lives. So it really is, every time you are dealing with a client, it's a brand new experience. No two clients are the same, no two homes are the same. And while the steps in the process are the same, um, there are 1,000 variations on each of those steps. So,
Great. Thank you for getting
mhm.
into that. That's a perfect segue into my next question. Will you walk us through the home buying and selling process and where your role comes into play when you talk about those steps?
Sure. Um, so I think that one thing that's important is consistency. Whether you're working with a buyer or whether you're working with a seller, there should be, or rather, in our company, there is a consistent workflow. So um, generally, we meet at the beginning and we provide disclosures about um, how a client could be represented and the fact that they are not yet represented at that first meeting. And so what they share is really important. Um, Meaning, if you're interviewing multiple people, um, at the beginning, you want to play your cards a little bit close to your chest, right? Because you don't want to share one thing with one professional that you wish that you hadn't if you hire a different professional, right?
Mhm.
So but a really good, strong real estate practitioner can help explain our Vermont mandatory consumer information disclosure. That's the name of the form. And sort of the roles and responsibilities at the beginning of a process of the buying and selling process, and sort of how that flows through to the end. So the question that you asked is, um, it's a big question, and I could give you a long answer. So I'm gonna try to um, I'm gonna try to keep it brief after making that just sort of disclosure.
Yeah.
Um, so again, like my role is pretty consistent from beginning to end. A realtor is more critical when at the decision making process. So if I'm going to start with a buyer, there's a questionnaire that I have them complete, so I know a little bit about them and I know a little bit about what they're looking for, and then we have a meeting. I prefer to meet somebody in the office because or at a coffee shop. It's a much more low pressure situation than meeting somebody at a house that they want to buy, because their focus is on the house. Um, and, at the beginning, I think you have the ability to remove a little bit of stress and anxiety out of the situation if you can go through the process itself. So, questionnaire, meeting, and then we start to look at some properties online. Most people are looking at properties online. It's I think it maybe is like the national pastime now, people to scroll Zillow. Um, so when we get into the discussion of sort of, have they seen any homes that they like? What are they looking for? And I'm speaking specifically about buyers right now. Um, then we can start to sort of drill down into, like, what are their needs versus what are their preferences. Um, and then we talk a little bit about where an attorney comes into the transaction, because at one point they will need one. We talk a little bit about the pre-approval process. There are times that buyers come and they are already pre-approved and they're already working with a lender. And there are times that buyers come and they know very little about the process. And and so we will talk to them about, having a strong lender partner, somebody that they feel like is responsive, that they can get their questions answered easily. Um, and we talk about the home searching process. So when we actually are going out to look at properties versus looking at them on a screen, and then we'll discuss what do we do when it's time to make an offer when they found the home that they want to pursue. Then we'll talk about the contracts involved in that process, um, and what happens once they're under contract. Um, and one thing I skipped a step, and one thing, and this is another reason why I like to have people come into the office is because we talk about buyer representation. I'm just going to add this, and this is actually a good spot where I can stop and ask a question of the folks on the call. So, does anybody know what buyer representation is? Or is anyone familiar with buyer representation?
I
Okay.
could make a guess, but I'm not entirely sure.
Okay.
Yep, and I see it. I'm not
I am
familiar.
not familiar. Okay. So when you own a house and you hire someone to sell your house, you hire a realtor or a licensed sales agent to sell your house, you basically hire them and like they put the sign in the lawn and it says this house is for sale by. And then that agent guides you, advocates for you, provides you with critical market information, and negotiates on your behalf throughout that process. So buyer's agent does all of those same things, except there's no ground in which to stick the sign, right? So buyers don't have a placard that says I'm represented by XYZ. Um,
Mhm.
but it is having a professional who's an expert who is advocating on your behalf as a buyer in the marketplace versus someone that is representing a seller in the marketplace. And the reason why we like to meet folks in the office is because we like to go over what the buyer representation process is, what it looks like. There's a contract that a buyer signs with the agent that is going to represent them. And it's important to review that contract in a relaxed environment and not while you're distracted by like somebody's beautiful black backsplash, you know?
Mhm.
And so buyers, if you're a first-time home buyer, you're gonna have so many questions about this process. And I think that the whole experience will be better if you can get them answered in an environment that is relaxed, that you feel totally comfortable, and that feels entirely free of pressure. So, sitting down to discuss the buyer representation agreement is really, really important. And often people want to launch into the shopping phase of
Yeah.
buying real estate because they've been scrolling on Zillow. But, reviewing buyer representation, it's like the best time in the process to go slowly. Um, if we, move to the seller side, it is similar, except if someone already owns a home, they've been through this process once, generally, right? Unless, they inherited that real estate. But so the work with the seller is a little bit different because it involves also marketing, right? How are we going to present that home to the market? And um, I'm happy to like dig a little bit more into the seller side if you want, but I think there are generally more questions in real estate about the buying side and buyer representation than there are about the selling side. And so I'm happy to go into the selling side, but I almost feel like the buy side may be more helpful and
Yeah.
relevant.
I agree with that. And I'm definitely what I'm hearing from you is that a big part of your role is building that rapport with your clients so they can feel confident in that buyer representation. So they feel
Mhm.
like they are being properly supported and adequately represented. And that feels like a big maybe not as obviously ethical, but a crucial part in making sure that you actually know who your client is and what they want, and you're able to represent them and go out and look for things that are going to support them, be able to answer lots of questions, and kind of be in a place where you're able to help them get to know what they don't know, so then they can even ask the questions that they need to ask related to properties. So that feels really beneficial. And I agree with you. I think sticking to the home buying aspect of things on this question is a little more relevant. Um, Moving into the next question, when considering the steps to purchasing a property, at what stages can discrimination take place? I also have for selling as well, but
Mhm.
if you want to start with purchasing, that would be really helpful.
This one I can kind of tackle all at once
Okay.
buy sell because like discrimination it can happen anywhere in the process,
Yeah.
right? It can happen on the phone at the beginning, it can happen when somebody comes into the office. Um it can happen, it can happen in the appraisal process, it can happen in the marketing process, it can happen in the negotiating process. So, you know, I don't, I don't think that as a buyer or a seller, I think you can be discriminated against, right? No matter where you are and who you are in the process. And so, I think like consistency of practice and transparency in process are really critical, right? Because if everybody is getting the same treatment, um, then you're establishing a level of consistency in the practice of real estate that people can rely on. And then if the process itself is transparent, right? If people have questions, you're answering them, or you're providing a really detailed explanation in a step in the process that people are going to be really unfamiliar with. So, like consistency of practice and transparency of process. So I think the other thing that I would say is when you are selecting a realtor, and this does loop back a little bit to the buyer conversation, but also to the seller conversation, you should feel like a priority as the customer, right? Until you decide to become a client, which is when you actually hire that realtor. Um, you should feel like a priority. You should feel like your agent is capable. You should feel like they're going to be a good advocate for you. And if at any point in the process that you don't, if there is a point in the process where you feel like that's not happening for you, um, then you should bring it up, or you should shop around, right? It is. I think sometimes, especially as a buyer, and certainly as a first-time home buyer, you you don't know what you don't know, and this process is so unfamiliar that you may feel like, oh, this is a stupid question, right? I shouldn't ask this. I should know this. No, you shouldn't. You shouldn't know. You're never going to know. It doesn't matter how much HGTV you've watched about real estate, right? You're not going to know. You should ask. You should ask the question. I say that like knowledge is power, and it also reduces stress. And so, the more you know, the better you're going to feel. And so like ask the question or bring up a point where something doesn't feel right to you or something potentially feels uncomfortable. But from like the side of the practitioner, if my practice is consistent and if I'm doing my very best to inform my clients proactively, um, it really like removes the opportunity for bias to influence outcomes.
That makes a lot of sense. And I was going to ask a follow-up question of what tips you might have for a buyer or seller in making sure that they're finding a good match with their realtor. And you named some key points, and making sure that that person is competent and answering your questions and advocating for you. I think if those things are missing in the relationship between buyer or seller and their real estate agent, then I think that could be a an important red flag that it might be time to shop around or look for another match. Do you have any other tips for people to figure out how to best align with a real estate professional that's going to support them?
I think that again in real estate there's a sense of urgency, right? Because competition, like in everyone's mind, competition is inherent in real estate. And so I think there's a sense of urgency sometimes. Um, and anything that you can do to sort of to dial that back. And so for a buyer or seller, it means, you know, being in touch with a realtor early in the process, right? Reading their reviews. If there are things that are important to you. So if you are a really analytical person and you and spreadsheets and data are your thing, right? There are realtors that are going to be a great match for you, right? But if you're a person who feels like, I really want to be shepherded through this process and I like a little bit of a softer touch, there are going to be other realtors that are going to be a better match for you in this process. So, you have to it's important ultimately that you trust whomever you um, work with. And so if you start that process early, if you start the interview process early, if you start the vetting process early, then you're removing the sort of speed pressure out of the equation. And so that would probably be my best bit of advice is like be proactive, start early. Um, you know, don't wait until like the house comes on the market that you've been looking and you've got your pre-approval letter, but you haven't contacted a realtor and you've been looking and looking and looking and looking and looking on whatever platform it is that you're searching real estate. And then you then contact a realtor once you see the house that you want. Like that adds pressure to the situation, right? You might click on a button and think that you're getting the listing agent and you're not, right? You might click on a button and you're going to a random realtor and you didn't check their references and you didn't check to see what their reviews are. And then, but you're in this pressure situation because you really want this house, and so you sort of remove your ability to like think critically about who you're going to hire and if they're going to be the best match for you throughout this process, because it is a process, right? It's very rarely like you see a house, you buy that house, right?
Yeah,
There's a process. You're working with, I've had clients that I've worked with for years and years, right? Because they weren't in a rush, but they wanted to find the right thing. We put everything in place so that when the right thing came up, they were prepared. But if you don't do that, it can feel a little bit more haphazard. It can feel a little bit more stressful. And like the consumer has a lot of control over removing that stress from the process. So start early.
got it. That makes sense. And when you talk about a sense of urgency, especially on like the buyer's end, can that come up just in general in the process of, because it's such a competitive field, and like are you able to accommodate to people who maybe have language barriers or have a disability or impairments that affect their executive function? Are you able to advocate for those clients and say, hey, this person just needs a couple more days before they can sign this paperwork because we need to have some service providers or support folks come in and support this person and actually understand what they're doing, what they're signing, what the process is? Is that a part of your practice, or does that show up?
So this speaks perfectly to what I was just talking about. If um, those circumstances exist, then best to have all of the supports lined up early,
Hmm.
right? Before you start shopping. And that way, there's time to learn the processes. There's time to talk about contracts. There's time to, because like the person on the other side of the deal, so if I'm working with a buyer, the seller has no obligation to wait, right? There's
Yeah.
no obligation to wait. And that's why that's why preparedness comes in. So yes, those resources do exist. And if we don't have access to them, in the um like immediately, then we are able to find them. But finding them in a situation where we're not under time pressure is preferable for everyone. So did that answer your question?
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Can you describe appraisal bias and share any instances you have heard of or have experienced of it when working with a client?
Um, so I have never experienced appraisal bias directly. So appraisers, they're their own profession, right? They're their own licensed profession. And while they work in real estate, it's an adjacent profession. Um, and I'm not an appraiser. Uh, but we've all read from the past and the present issues with appraisal bias. And it can show up in how sales are selected or how a property is evaluated. Um, the thing that I take responsibility for as a listing agent is how a property is presented and supported with data. Um, and really that's when it can go off the rails, right? Like if a value is supported with data, it's hard to argue
Mhm.
with, right? If a value is supported with a bias, it's very easy to argue with, right? And it's obvious. So, if something doesn't feel right in the appraisal process, it's important to question it because you can usually, with hard data, um, either confirm or um, disprove a value, right? You can either confirm or deny that something is in a range that is reasonable given the other comparable sales that exist in the marketplace. And this is like a little bit. Appraisers are like the appraisal. Does everybody know what the appraisal process is? How about that? Let me just start there. Does
If you
anyone
want to
not know what an
summarize it
appraisal
for,
is? Yeah.
I know what an appraisal is, but if
Mhm.
you want to summarize it for us so everyone knows, that would be awesome.
Sure. So an appraisal is like the official assessment of value of a home. Like, and I could probably look up the definition, but sort of practically speaking, um, if someone has a home and they list it for a certain price and somebody agrees to pay that price and is going to use a mortgage to finance that property, um, the bank, the lender, is going to order an appraisal, and that appraisal is going to make sure that that housing asset is worth what what the buyer is saying that they would like to pay for it, right? And so they are basically derailed, but do I see the discrimination against government appraisals versus conventional appraisals? I got your Kayla, I got your I'll get back to your comment. Sorry. Um, so anyway, that is what an appraisal is. And I think when discrimination has historically existed in the appraisal process, it has been where a home owned by a specific nationality was valued differently than a home owned by a different nationality, right, from the original owner. And sort of that's where the bias has come in. And I'm really oversimplifying, so forgive me. But so that's what an appraisal is, right? It's an assessment of value. And if you're basing the assessment of value on data that exists in the marketplace, that's one thing. But if you're basing the assessment of value on property, that is entirely another thing. And right, so that's like appraisal bias.
And could be discriminatory.
Absolutely. It absolutely could be
Yeah.
and has been,
Um,
right? But I'm not, again, I've not experienced that in my profession or witnessed it in my profession. But it's highly documented that that has existed and exists. Um,
Absolutely. I'm going to read out the question in the chat and we can get to this comment first before I move into my questions, just because it's on topic. Um, Kayla says, I am a housing counselor, so I don't want to derail, but do you see discrimination against government appraisals versus conventional appraisals? Example, preference from owners or listing agents.
um, so Kayla, I want to make sure that I really understand the question that you're asking. Um, so when you
So
say yeah,
I
okay, thank
wasn't,
you.
I was like, I can come off mute. So if it helps. So I guess I work with first-time home buyers. I'm a housing
Mhm.
counselor, and I hear anecdotally very commonly that if I get a USDA loan or a VA loan or an FHA loan, which, have their own are different than a conventional appraisal. I get the worry all the time from first-time home buyers that they're going to be discriminated against based on that financing type. And I think in an ideal world from the outside, I've spoken to lawyers and stuff like that that are like, oh, absolutely, that's housing discrimination. They shouldn't be doing that. But then on a case by case basis, it feels like owners call the shots and can quite easily say conventional loan only. So that's, I guess, what I'm saying.
Okay, I understand. And your owners call the shots. I mean, like it's their property, right? And at the end of the day, they're the ultimate decision maker, and the buyer is the ultimate decision maker about what they're going to buy and how much they're going to pay for what they're going to buy. And the seller is the ultimate decision maker on who they're going to sell their home to. And so I think if the perception exists that there is a potential different level of stringency around um, certain types of appraisals, it you know, a seller might say, well, I want as simple a process as possible, right? So there could be a misconception or a misperception that certain types of appraisals are more difficult to go through than others. Um, Truly, at the end of the day, it is the seller's decision, and often first-time home buyers are buying in a competitive price point, and so certainly every um, factor of their offer is important, right? What contingencies are in their offer? What price are they offering? What's their timeline for closing? Like all of those things are going to be considered. And often the simplest offers are the most attractive. Um, so, I hope that I'm providing a little bit of insight there. There are still lots of VA loans and FHA loans and VHFA loans and USDA loans in the marketplace, um, and at least that I see, like within my company. Um, but at the end of the day, it is the seller's decision who they opt to work with. And so if the landscape is competitive, um, they may take the lowest hanging fruit. Hopefully that's helpful, Kayla.
It is. I definitely have those conversations a lot. So, it's tough. I think it's some of the most vulnerable borrowers that are like, well, this is what I can get. I'm a VA.
Mhm.
VA. This is something I've earned. It's tough.
A- Absolutely. And I totally agree with you. And oftentimes those programs, for people who can access those programs are like they beat a lot of what else is on the market conventionally, like available. And so, having access to those different financing programs, I think is a real benefit. And I think when you are shopping in a competitive landscape, um, there are all types of hurdles that are generated by competition. So I am sympathetic to those first time home buyers. Very.
Thank you so
It can
much.
be, yeah, it can be tough out
Yeah.
there for
Yeah.
them.
Well, thank
And,
you so much
you
for your
know,
time.
yeah, and they can't lose heart, right? Like it'll happen as it's meant to happen. They can't lose heart. Like they have to just, they've got to stick with it.
Kayla, I appreciate you highlighting this reality and bringing to light that people who first-time homeowners who are in receipt of these certain kind of special programs or grants that they can get come with some parameters or even red tape that might be less attractive to a seller. And this could potentially be a fair housing issue if it's based on people being in receipt of public assistance. But I hear what Jessica is saying as well, as because this is such a competitive field, the quicker and easier someone can get their money is the option that they might choose, it sounds like. But there can be some fair housing implications in the way in which that decision is being made, even if the seller ultimately has the choice to choose who they want to sell to. So I think it was a great fair housing connection there, and also segues into my next question. Um, do you support buyers with finding special programs or resources that can help with their home buying journey?
Yeah, so there's a lot of resources. There are a lot of resources available. And so let's, talk about like VHFA. VHFA has some incredible programs. I don't know if I can do it certainly, but maybe Jess Hyman, if you wanted to, you could also pop VHFA's a link to VHFA's homebuyer services in the chat. Fantastic. Um, FHA, first time homebuyer programs, VA, uh, incredible. If you have access and you have served, and that is the type of loan that you have available to you, incredible. Like absolutely try to take advantage of that. Um, there are lenders. Oftentimes, there are lenders that work more frequently with those type of programs, and so we can point buyers in the direction of lenders that have more familiarity with those programs. Um, and there's also, thanks, Jess, for popping that in. Um, there's also Champlain Housing Trust. So CHT doesn't work with realtors, but they are incredible. And there are programs available to people. And if you qualify for one of those CHT programs, then you should like you like get on that. Um, so oftentimes, if we do think that somebody is a candidate that would potentially qualify for CHT, then we will just point them in that direction and just say, you should like fully vet their projects and programs. And and if you aren't a match, then we're here when you're ready. But that Jess, thanks for popping that in the chat too. Um, yes, so CHT, if you're a first time home buyer, you should check out Champlain Housing Trust and you should check out Vermont Housing Finance Agency first time home buyer programs. And yeah, CHT shared equity program. That's the one I was mentioning that um, CHT doesn't work with realtors, they work directly with the buyers. And that's great because we are happy to direct them there and hand them right off.
Awesome. Thank you for that. And for the sake of time, I'm going to just ask maybe two more questions. And
Sure.
if people in the chat want to ask their questions around 12:50 or so, I'm happy to allow that time to take place and shorten my question time. How can implicit bias show up in real estate practices? What should realtors do to avoid implicit or explicit bias from impacting the well-being of a buyer or a seller in their transaction?
So I think the first thing I will say, like the way to avoid it is to just remove assumptions entirely. And also education,
Hmm.
right? Like mm, as a professional, it's my responsibility to educate myself about the current landscape. And that is a priority for the realtor community. The board that I belong to, Northwest Vermont Realtor Association, we education is one of our primary focuses year after year after year. So education is paramount. But again, there's no way to know when the phone rings, right? There's no way to know who's on the other end of it, and so it's important to be curious. It's really important not to assume anything. Like the criteria is clear. Again, like the the process has to be transparent. The practice has to be consistent. Um, Clients define their own goals, right? I don't define what a buyer client is looking for. That is for them to define. I can tell them if what they're looking for exists in the geographic location that they are saying they want to live in. I can tell them if what they're looking for exists in the price range that they are shopping in, right? And if it doesn't exist, right, it's not discriminatory for me to say like that doesn't exist, right? We have to either adjust the budget or we have to expand the geography or you have to decrease the number of bedrooms that you're looking for or be satisfied with a lesser square footage. But that's all based on, again, that's based on data. That's based on housing supply. But buyers and sellers really they define their own um, parameters. Um, and I think implicit bias is it can be very subtle. It can be very subtle, and so it's important again to just let the client guide their um, their preferences and the process as it relates to their preferences. And also, you have to be disciplined in your practice, right? You have to practice consistently. So hopefully I answered your question.
Yeah, you did. And I was actually just going to say it comes back to what you were saying about the consistent practices and keeping a standard and how the real estate professional interacts with all of their clients and making sure to hear what their needs are, hear what their wants are,
Hmm.
and work within their budget and help them achieve their goals based on, like you said, what options are actually available and really keeping the client centered and uplifting their voice and needs and desires in a space opposed to oh I know implicit biases what someone might know about a specific community and trying to
Hmm.
steer people from one place or the other or making assumptions about people's financial situations, so many things that could come up, and really
Hmm.
just keeping focused on the client and their needs and helping them have the most successful experience as possible.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I do think that it's why it's really important to match up with somebody who you feel like listens to you.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, if you buy something that if you come to me and you tell me this is what I want and I help you find what you want, then at the end of the day, you as the client have to take responsibility for saying that that was what you wanted, right? And I have to take responsibility for listening and telling you, like, okay, great, here it is. Let's now get it. But um, if I'm steering the ship, those people are not going to be happy in a month. They're not going to be happy in 6 months. They're not going to be happy in a year, right? Because it's not going to be what they were looking for. And that's like, when you're buying a home, it's a very emotional process, right? And you sort of see yourself there, and you want help in getting to that place. You don't want help in getting to my place, because if you end up in my place, you're not going to be happy.
Mhm.
So it really is all about what the client wants and being able to listen to them, and then telling them, like, having a real conversation about whether or not it exists in their geography, in their budget, and moving from there.
And just a follow-up question to that,
Mhm.
have you ever experienced having to like coach a client to keep their goals based on the amenities of a property and the location opposed to who lives in the area? Have people ever come up to you and said, "Oh, I want my kids to grow up around people that look like them, or that people that speak the same language as us?" And do you have to kind of orient them to what I can do is help you find a place that fits your needs and less about the community or types of people in a place?
Yeah, so I will say that I've not been asked either of those things, or right, asked to find either of those things based on those criteria. But when someone is interested in learning about the community, then I say that you need to spend some time in the community, right?
Hmm.
I Your experience of the community may be totally different than my experience of the community, right? Or I can say, "Oh, I have other clients that live in this community. I'll put you in touch with them, and you can speak to them directly." You know, um, and that is why, like, again, this is a client-led journey. And if it's why when folks say that I'm relocating, and I can either rent or I can buy, you should rent. And as a realtor, like, this is not a popular opinion. Um, but if unless you have some information about, like, the again, like, the community that you are honing in on, or you've done a lot of research, like, that's the other thing. Like, I can do research on a neighborhood, but at the end of the day, I'm not the one that's going to live there. And my research is going to look like, how many homes have sold? What was the median price of those homes? How long did it take them to sell? We can, Google map, what's the proximity to this resource or that resource, or proximity to the pool, proximity to the bus stop, proximity to the grocery store. Um, but none of that research is going to explain what it feels like to live in the community. And the best way to do that is to have some community experiences. Go to the park, go to the farmers market, um, really roll your sleeves up and get in there. Or find community members that are willing to share with you their experiences. That is, and again, that's why I feel like we started by talking about, like, starting this process early and being prepared, being as prepared as you can be, because the outcome will be better. Because I'm prepared, right? This is what I do for a living, and this is what realtors do for a living. So, like, we're prepared to work with buyers, we're prepared to work with sellers, we understand the process. But we're not the buyers and the sellers. And so it is important for a buyer specifically to have started early and done the research and made sure that they feel that, they've hired a good match in their lender and a good match in their realtor. Um, and it just makes for an overall more satisfying process in the short term and in the long term, because you're buying a house to probably live there for quite some time, right? You're putting down roots. And so it's important, if you're going to put down, it's like a plant, right? If you're going to plant it in the ground, you're going to put down roots. You want to know about the environment. But if it's just going to be a potted plant, you have the ability to move around, right?
Yeah.
So you want to make sure the soil is healthy. You want to make sure that there's fertilizer available to you and that you get enough sun. And so I don't want to oversimplify, but it is, being highly involved in knowing about the environment that you want to live in. Like that is a client responsibility, right? And it is our job once the client identifies that to help them secure it.
Great. So what I'm hearing is that it is really important for a client of any kind to really hone in on what their goals are. And that's a great way to
Mhm.
prepare for this home buying process.
Yes. We have a question. We asked, what are the 5 things that you want in a house and the 5 things you don't want in a house, right? Sometimes the don't want list becomes way more important. We
Yeah.
see a lot more changes on the want list and a lot less changes on the don't want list. And those are important, right? And we refer back to that. And if I have a client that's like, oh, I want to be within walking distance of XYZ, and then they call me because they found a rural property on 10 acres near nothing. I'm like, well, here it says that, you didn't want to be rural. You wanted, yeah, but we found a house we really like. Well, are you going to be happy in that house 6 months from now? Are you going to be happy in that house in the middle of the winter? Right? Like those are, and that's the role of the realtor. Not to tell you where you should live, but to remind you where you said you wanted to live, so that we're trying for long-term happiness,
Yeah.
right? Not just like, okay, great, you're going to buy this house, fantastic. Like, are we sure? Let's go back and revisit what was really important to you at the beginning and make sure that if something has shifted, that it's really shifted, or you're not just exhausted by the process, right? Or
Mhm.
exhausted by how long it has taken, or exhausted by getting outbid sometimes in a competitive environment. So again, it's like when you hear real estate as a relationship business, it is. And so it is important to make sure that the relationship that you are going to wind up forming with your realtor is a good one and you feel good about it. Um, yeah. And I personally, I mean, I do this for a living, right? So I deeply believe in like the realtor's commitment to the profession. Um, and I do think that like it starts with our community, and it is a great, and um we're a good resource, but start early.
Great. Thank you. And on that note, thank you to Kayla. I see that you have to head out. Thank you so much for joining us. I do want to pass it over to other online participants to see if folks have any questions. Otherwise, I will do my closing spiel and we'll wrap up.
Okay.
Feel free to raise your hand or come off mute if anything comes up. Great. It doesn't look like anyone has any other questions. Thank you, Sophia. Awesome. So I'll wrap us up. The webinar is coming to a close. Thank you so much to Jessica for describing your work and how the practices that you use help create an ethical environment in the companies that you own and work in. This is a wrap to our 2026 Fair Housing Friday webinar series. I think we had a great conversation, and I'm so glad to have you on as a guest. If you'd like to stay updated with all things fair housing related at CVOAO, please make sure to check out our Fair Housing Month VT.org website and follow our social media. If you missed any previous Fair Housing Fridays, they will be uploaded to our website where people can watch them. And if you missed any of the resources in the chat, they will also be sent to you in a follow-up email. And I will hand it over to Jessica one more time in case there's anything that you want to leave our guests with.
Sure. I just would like thank you again for having me. I appreciate it. And also, we are, I am, and I feel like my company is a good resource. And so if you have questions, or if you wanted to get a coffee and just feel like, hey, I'm far from starting the process. Like, what do I do? Where do I go? Those resources that just threw in the chat are like chef's kiss for first time home buyers. So like definitely copy those. Um, but if you want to talk about the process, or Kayla, if you wanted to reach out as a housing counselor, like I would happily speak with any of you. And I think my email is probably attached to this somewhere, or will wind up on the website, or um,
I'll
yeah.
make sure to add
So
contact
please reach out.
information, yeah,
Okay,
to the follow-up email.
cool.
And thank you so much again for coming. This was really a wonderful conversation. And like I said, all of these resources will be available to everyone if they want to move forward with talking with any of the guests that we've had on for Fair Housing Friday.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.